Hi, I'm Thomas McGrath. I work at Archives Wigan Leigh, and I also look at history as well. The thing that I like about history is that it feels a bit like time travel. So although we can't physically send ourselves back in time to the past, we can look at old documents or old photographs, and we can sort of transport ourselves somewhat into the past. The part of history that I really enjoy the most is social history, which is just the history of everyday places and people. So how ordinary people lived their lives in the past, what they did every day, what kind of houses they lived in, what they ate, what they wore, things like that. Tyldesley is a town in the Wigan Borough, is an absolutely fascinating town, and we're going to look at the history of one particular street called Wareing Street. So it's actually very cold today, but it's nice and clear and sunny, which is great for where we are in Tyldesley, and we're just walking up past the guided busway. So I couldn't have chosen a better spot to introduce today's town. This is Tyldesley, and behind me is the wonderful church of St George's. This is a local landmark and it's one of my favourite spots in Tyldesley. Let's have a look at a bit more of Tyldesley's history. So here we are in Tyldesley, and we're stood outside of St George's Church, which has just celebrated its 200th anniversary. Tyldesley though is much older than that. Around 1728, Thomas Johnson began to buy land here to turn into an estate, but it was his grandson, who was also called Thomas Johnson, who actually began to develop the Tyldesley Banks estate. And it's called Banks because the town is built up on high embankments. This was later nicknamed Bongs. Tyldesley began to develop later on in the 18th century after Thomas Johnson started to build upon the town. So in 1789 we have Tyldesley Top Chapel being built, and then in the 1820s we have this church and the old school being built as well. The Industrial Revolution really powered Tyldesley's fortunes. So the first woolen mill was built in 1792, and later in the 19th century it was cotton and coal which would dominate the area. Here we are on Wareing Street, which is one of the most fascinating streets in Tyldesley, and that's because when you look at the buildings here you can really get a sense of the different people who lived here and the different history that was on this street. Wareing Street was laid out in the late 1830s or early 1840s, and it was named after Thomas Johnson's wife, Susanna Wareing. The top end of the street, where we're stood now, was made up of working class houses. In the years after the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, a lot of Irish immigrants settled here, but the street is quite mixed. And if you travel further down Wareing Street, we'll see some of the bigger houses lived in by more wealthy people in Tyldesley. Here we can see some of the bigger houses behind me on Wareing Street, which were lived in by doctors, bankers, grocers, and other influential people in the town. But did you know that actually they lived right next door to some of the poorest people on Wareing Street? Just down the little ginnel at the side of these houses was some slum houses known as Back Wareing Street. In 1881, there were two different families living in a two-roomed house. Here's another building which tells us a little bit about the history of Wareing Street. As you can see, this is an old pub and it's named the Railway. But why was there a pub in the middle of a residential street? Well, just at the bottom of Wareing Street down there was a railway station, and it was built in the 1860s and knocked down in the 1960s. And here we are at the bottom of Wareing Street now, and just behind me is where Tyldesley railway station would have stood. Although the railway line is now gone, the guided busway from Leigh to Manchester runs along it. So we've got lots of different maps and plans here at the archives. This is a really exciting one. It's of Tyldesley and it's 175 years old. It's an old tithe map which shows us who paid rents to the church in the past. Let's have a look. As you can see from the map, every plot of land and every property is numbered. This tells us who either rented that house or piece of land or who owned it. And here we can see Wareing Street, surrounded by open fields. Now we're going to go down to the strong rooms and look at some of our interesting collections which will help you trace the history of your house or the street where you now live. We have a lot of records here that can help you do this, such as the census. but today I'm going to show you the ratepayers books, which help us fill in the gaps in between census records. The ratepayers books are the equivalent of council tax in the past. So we can see who was paying what and who was living where. This is an absolutely fascinating record, and it's one that we use an awful lot here at the archives. This is the ratepayers book for Tyldesley from 1905, and what it tells us is who lived in a house, who owned that house, what type of property it was, whether it was a house, a shop or a pub, and then also how much they paid in rent. Okay, so we've seen the ratepayers book and we've seen the map, but what other records do we hold here at Archives Wigan Leigh which can tell us more about life in Tyldesley in the past? Well, we have these excellent newspaper clippings which will help us contextualise what life was like in Tyldesley in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they're full of interesting articles and stories and photographs about everyday people, places and just general life. The other one, which are very useful, are these biographical cutting boxes, which people use a lot when they come in to do their family history. Here we have some information about Robert Isherwood, who was born in Tyldesley in 1845, and from the age of 9 he worked in the coal mines. In 1870 he left the mines and established a building business, as well as successfully running 2 grocery businesses. He spent his whole life trying to help his neighbours and those less fortunate than himself. He lived at Canonbury House. After he died, the house was inherited by his son, Fred Isherwood. Fred was also greatly involved in civic life. He was a member of the Education Committee, a county magistrate, and president of Tyldesley Swimming Club. Fred was also well travelled, but he stated, "If Tyldesley has been good enough to earn your living in, then it is good enough to spend your retirement in." And finally, we have Dorothy Isherwood, who was Fred's daughter and Robert's granddaughter. Dorothy had a distinguished career in her own right. She became a chief officer of the Women's Royal Naval Service during the Second World War, and in 1947 she was awarded a CBE by King George VI for her wartime service.